I'm joined again today by Robert Rowland Smith. Hi, Robert.
Hello, Mark. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, my friend, my collaborator, and becoming now my regular conversation partner in this series that we have on psychotherapy. And Robert, today I thought we might talk about another huge subject in the work of figures from Freud and Jung. It's become a sort of part of everyday parlance now, which is the notion of the unconscious. And maybe just to leap in, I once had a supervisor, and whenever I said, "Oh, I think in their unconscious," or "I think in the unconscious," they would immediately leap in and say, "You shouldn't say the or there." That trying to sort of point at the unconscious was already a sort of mistaken way to try and engage with it,
Yeah,
because the supervisor's point was, well, maybe just as a starter, there isn't the unconscious. There's just that of which we're not conscious. It may be present, active, you know, even more dynamic than we regard ourselves in our lives, but we're just unconscious of the fact.
mm.
So that was a sort of a point that always stuck with me when trying to talk about this subject.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let me pick that up and run with it because I like that a lot. Not the unconscious, but just unconsciousness. A bit like dark matter or something. You might refer to it as. Although I think it's maybe for our viewers and listeners, it might be worth just helping a bit with a definition that is the unconscious. Just maybe briefly, I'll say what Freud's definition is in his early work, anyway. Because in fact, later on, as you know, he does develop a sort of much more um, mysterious notion, really, of what the unconscious is, and he talks about it at the group level and the instinctual level and so on. So it becomes more complicated. But shall I say something about the kind of classical Freudian definition
Yeah,
then?
no, it's good to have a starter, because then at least we can, make progress from somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the first point to say is that for Freud, there is the unconscious, and it arises developmentally. So it's the result of other things. So if we think of the development of infants very simply, we are born, and pretty much from the moment we're born, we have what Freud calls an ich, an ego. But all that really is just giving a name to a wishing function, because all that little infants want is just to be fed or to be held or to be have their nappy changed or whatever it might be. So it's just basic wishing, and that's what Freud calls the ich, the I, or the ego, as it gets translated. And that's all well and good until pretty early on, actually, in human development. The infant then realizes they're not always going to get what they want, to quote a famous Rolling Stones song. There are siblings who might get in the way. So if the infant wants to be fed by the mother's breast, for example, they might realize there's a sibling who wants to get there first, or dad might get in the way. So they have this sense quite early on that there's an ego, but then there's this thing which cuts across it and says, no, you can't always have it, which is the no function. And that creates the superego, which moderates desire and wanting. So now we have two things in the picture: first ego, then superego. A kind of yes, I want it. No, you can't have it, or you'll have to wait. And then for Freud, at least, the unconscious is the result of the clash between these two things. The unconscious is the repository of all the egoic wishes that aren't met. So it's yes, the repository of frustrated desire, I suppose, is one way of just describing it. And excuse me, in early Freud, that there is the unconscious. It lives somewhere inside the psyche. Probably maybe on another episode we'll talk about the difference between psyche and mind, or psyche and brain, but that's a different subject.
Actually, just to leap in there, I mean,
Yeah.
one idea which I think is helpful from this earlier idea of Freud is because I think he felt it could live in the body, and I think he even says the first ich, the first ego, is the body ego, and that's actually, as a sort of as a model, it's actually quite a helpful notion, because often very early or difficult feelings are held in the body. And so you can get into notions like the psychosomatic, or using the body in therapy, and these sort of very primitive and basic things. Yeah, so this, you know, as with all this stuff, actually, this is all sort of models and approaching that which sort of exceeds the capacity to understand it. So there's still use in this early Freudian description.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you position Freud in the history of ideas, which is a rather kind of grandiose thing to say, perhaps, but it's quite remarkable, although there are antecedents for the notion of the unconscious. So, you know, Freud didn't invent or discover the unconscious, although his formulation was original. When you put it in the history of ideas, it is still pretty surprising because, I mean, you're a philosopher, Mark, you know, I am. We know that the entire history of philosophy is about consciousness, really, or reason, or becoming more awake. And so even the idea that there's an unconscious is sort of a bit scandalous. It's a bit like the the equivalent in Victorian life of admitting people have a sex life. You know, there's stuff that goes on, you know, in the bedroom or in the attic or below decks, you know, which hadn't really hitherto been spoken about or named or cited. And yet suddenly this thing is being pointed at by Freud as if to say, well, the history of philosophy and ideas tells us we're rational scientific agents, but actually we're not. So I think for me, you know, worth pointing out just how revolutionary that is, just as a thought, you know, in the 19th century. Maybe the other equivalent would have been evolution, you know, a massive jolt to some of the assumptions of life, you know, in the late 19th century.
I don't want to sort of get ahead of ourselves, but as you say that, I'm wondering whether, you know, as a moment in history when this idea does come about, whether it's as much a comment on the moment in history as if it were, you know, as much as a sort of discovery, and maybe the notion of the unconscious comes about then because of a kind of disenchantment that's taken place. You know, whereas before human beings would have experienced forces of which they weren't conscious coming from gods or from place, you know, the influence of ancestors, rather than being the production of repressed material inside their own psyche or held in their own body. And so perhaps, you know, a notion of the unconscious can only come about when, well, after Freud, Nietzsche put it, you mentioned Darwin and Freud, so might as well bring in Nietzsche as well, the other three great skeptics, you know, after the death of God. That when the world dies and becomes, well, dark matter, as the physicist means it at least, then you've got to come up with a different theory as to how we're influenced by that which we're not, well, certainly not in control of, but not even aware of. And so
well,
the
Mark, I'm going to meet your stakes and raise them even further.
Okay, good. Yeah,
it's incredibly. Normally, we don't do this, but on this very grand tableau of history, because. Okay, to Darwin and Freud and Nietzsche, I'll add Marx, because in the 19th century, you know, the other huge discovery of the, you know, hitherto repressed is of the worker, you know, the working class. The fact that, you know, labor is produced by these forces that are often, you know, not taken account of. So we've got, you know, three kind of complete Copernican jolts to our sense of what it is to be human there, haven't we? We've got, yeah, the dark matter in the absence of God. We've got Freud in the unconscious. We've got Marx in the working class. You know, suddenly all these veils are being torn apart.
Or are they veils? You know, was Nietzsche actually right that it springs from the death of something? So it's not so much. It is a jolt. I have no doubt about that. But it's not like a Copernican discovery. It's more like the jolt of a terrible loss, which is this loss of a sense that our life is born of other lives or other life. Yeah. Which, you know, in traditional Christian worldview would, of course, be called gods, called the divine.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite a ferment, isn't it, that all this is coming out of?
You know, maybe that. Sorry. Well, no. So maybe that's, you know, why Freud can't quite put the death of God down, and, you know, keeps returning to it. You know, he was an avowed atheist. There's no doubt about that. But there's something about the question of God, and he comes up with his own various accounts, you know, imaginative or factual, you know, depending on how you read him, to account for the idea of the divine in the psyche. He certainly isn't trying to prove the existence of God in a more straightforward sense, philosophical sense, but to account for this felt reality, at least in the psyche, in the unconscious.
Well, exactly. Yeah, you can get rid of God, but you can't get rid of the absolute power of the Father, as incorporated or as felt. It reminds me actually that, Jacques Lacan, who we mentioned, I think, last time perhaps, has this punning French phrase, le nom du père, the name of the father, which is obviously a sort of Catholic reference. But le nom in French also sounds as the not or the no of the father, as well as the name of the father, which corresponds to this idea of the superego. The father is the one who says no, whereas mummy says yes, daddy says no, kind of thing.
Well, should we sort of bring in Jung as well?
Yeah, go for
this
it.
point. So, because Jung has a different idea of what's unconscious from Freud. For Jung, there can be repressed personal material, that which is either taboo or was denied, caused suffering or pain in some way. But that's only the beginning of the story, because he was a great Darwinist, he also had an idea of evolution that we receive. We're not sort of tabula rasa, the more Lockean approach perhaps of Freud, just sort of impressed upon by what happens to us in our own lives. But that we, much as we, receive 5 fingers on each hand because at one point some deep ancestor of the fish had 5 sets of bones in its fin, so too our psyches are the evolutionary inheritors of the deep past. And so there's such a thing as what he called the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is not just that which happened before, but because it's inherited not just by us, but by everything else around us too, it's alive and active even more broadly. And so you get a sort of sense of the opening up of what's unconscious, the unconscious. I mean, I think, Jung still talked about the unconscious, actually, didn't he? But you get a much bigger sort of opening up of it once more. And a lot of Jung's efforts were trying to see evidence for this. So trying to show how someone might have a dream with details in it that they couldn't possibly have known about before the dream, and yet resonated with imagery you might find in alchemical material, for example, to show that, or in ancient myth, to show that we're the receivers of what is unconsciously acting upon us, that speaks the language of symbol and metaphor.
That's a very, very nice point, Mark, to be reminded of that Darwin connection, evolutionary connection, because the idea of a shared unconscious isn't just that it's shared in the now, or we happen to all somehow have access to some invisible pool or reservoir of imagery, but it's shared in the sense of a shared ancestry. It's built up over kind of deep time. And the point about archetypes, for example, is they're not made up on the moment. There's no such thing really as a modern archetype. It's almost a contradiction in terms. An archetype is ancient, and it's ancient and has accrued those sediments and that patina to it because of generations and generations of reinforcement of what those archetypes are. So they've established patterns over generations, even millennia perhaps, that then are not only the accumulation of experience that then gets codified as symbol or archetype, but then in turn have a determining effect on us, because whether we dream them or access those archetypes in other ways, and they could be very basic archetypes like self and shadow, or more sophisticated ones like king or something, they in turn then have a determining effect on us and on society and on our behavior and how we fall into different, not just individual identities, but into different roles in society, for example. So the ancestry point, I think, is a critical one, and I hadn't thought about that for a long time. So
yeah, I mean, I think I'm right in saying that Jung used the notion of archetype to account for a lot of behavior amongst creatures in the natural world too. So the bird that's never taught how to build a nest and yet does one, or the caterpillar that turns into a pupa and suddenly knows how to hang from the bottom of a leaf, something it had never done before. A lot of the natural world, I guess it would be called instinct, but maybe the word instinct being asked to do rather a lot more work than it can to account for these very, very sophisticated behaviors that, as it were, in the life of the individual creature spring as if out of nowhere. But of course, Jung would say that precisely don't.
Well, actually, it's probably on the word instinct that Freud and Jung meet one another again, because they had a very famous falling out, partly over the notion of the collective unconscious, actually, because for Freud, it was much more an individual thing, for Jung, a much more collective thing. But in his later work, in the 1930s, certainly, but before that too, Freud starts to use the language of instinct, and particularly species instinct. And, he talks about phylogenetic instincts and so on, as if there is a collective will. For example, the death wish. I mean, it's it's become popularized, a notion now. But, he's writing in with the prospect of a war coming around. He leaves Vienna in the 30s with the rise of the Nazis and so on. And he's really thinking about what, at the level of civilization, are these mass unconscious instincts. Although he never talks about the collective unconscious, they are mass instincts. And he talks about, mass psychology. It gets translated as group psychology, but things which are held by the collective. And, it's led to all sorts of work on, for example, panic in social groups. What sets off a panic? What is that contagion where no individual wants it, but the group as a whole begins to act in a way, or a mob, begins a lynching, or even mass movements in not just right, but also left-wing, politics. There's something about group instinct at an unconscious level which overtakes kind of conscious, rational, individual agency.
Yeah, well, look, thanks for that, because I'd never thought of that before, actually, that there is a notion of the collective unconscious in Freud, with that idea of instincts. And also, I mean, it's very helpful to hear that it's mass rather than group behavior that he's talking about, because that, as often with Freud, actually, you do have to watch the translations, don't you?
You do, yes, because it's math. The word is mass and psychology. Is that right? I can't. Apologies to the viewers if I've misremembered that, but I'm pretty sure it's mass rather than group. But anyway,
yeah,
maybe we'll be corrected in the comments.
So look, maybe to take things another step in another a related direction, I hope, which came to mind as you were speaking there. I suppose a more positive use of the word unconscious would be when people sort of turn to the unconscious, or somehow try to conjure or invoke it in order to get new ideas, or maybe even to have a vision. The writer of novels will often say that the characters start to write themselves, which I guess you could try and account for as if it's coming from their unconscious. And sometimes people will say that in order to get a good idea, a new idea, to try and foster a different turning in life, you need to turn to that which we're not conscious of now, maybe have forgotten, or it's sort of hidden on the other side of the shadow, in order to get a different steer, a different possibility forming, manifesting for us. And I mean, I'm intrigued by that notion, but again, I do wonder whether it's still a bit of a post-Nietzschean flatland idea, and the unconscious is being made to do work that before would have been called inspiration, it being inspired by intelligence, say, that is broader and wider than our own intelligence, and yet is part of our intelligence. Or another word in this sort of domain would be the imagination, and how we're very inclined, a bit like the unconscious, to regard the imagination now as sort of our own, perhaps astonishing or remarkable capacity, but nonetheless sort of somehow springing from our individual psyche. Whereas I think there's another account that would be in the Romantics, and although I think the word imagination itself is relatively recent, there would be an older sense that actually the imagination is a kind of participation in a wider creativity. It's not our own creativity that catches us by surprise, or luckily adds a bit of color to life, but is a connection with a wider field that exists, is there, is active, but of which we're often unconscious. Now, you can sort of nudge that in a religious direction, which I'd be inclined to do, talk about the divine, or just try and keep it more naturalistically understood, but it's still an effort to return to a sort of enchantment of the world that there's, more dreamt of in your philosophy.
I want to come back to the notion of field, but just on your connection between the unconscious and the imagination as sitting in some kind of accessible but out of reach reservoir, if you like, that's there for us all, but is not easily accessed always. And I want to add to that, because you mentioned sort of creativity in that as well, whether one of the things that marks out acts of creativity and creators is that there is a kind of courage or fearlessness in going into the unconscious or the imaginary material that would normally be censored or repressed or corrected or forbidden, when brought out into ordinary life. And we can think of the history of artists, so many of them were vilified actually when their work was at first shown because it seemed to contravene social norms, as if they were literally fishing out of the depths those elements, those imagined but unallowed, unconscious, disallowed elements that the society knew were there, but only had its creators and artists to express because their mechanisms of self-censorship just weren't as strong as they are for most of us, because we spend a lot of our time self-censoring. So for me, there's that connection too between imagination and the unconscious as that which we don't have permission to bring to the surface.
Yeah, and pops up in dreams or
exactly
in Freudian slips or sort of strange fantasies that we have during the day.
Yeah.
And of course, in psychotherapy, that's one way which you work with what's unconscious, that which happens unexpectedly or a dream. I mean, many psychotherapists, certainly in the areas that I work, who are very open to this kind of idea, would even want to say that the dream is the only objective material that you can have in a psychotherapeutic session. Was that a Freudian slip? I don't think so quite. Precisely because it's not under the control of the ego, that it's sprung up from some other place. Now it may be quite tricky to know what to make of it, but nonetheless, being on the lookout for that kind of thing is fundamental to real transformation, rather than just trying to keep going in the ways that you know already.
Yeah, and obviously a strong connection between dreams and imagination, and particularly in the literary tradition. I was thinking of what for me is one of the kind of founding texts of certainly English literature, which is Piers Plowman. I don't know if you ever read that, but
no, I don't know that. Yeah,
William Langland wrote this poem. It's a medieval text, and it's about a wanderer who basically falls asleep, on this hillside in a kind of pastoral scene, and then dreams the poem. So that connection between dreaming and imagination, I think, is very strong, and it's because it's somehow unconscious in some way, and the imagination is the engine of that in some way.
That's very fascinating. I'm working on William Blake, and Blake will say that some of his poems were dictated to him by, say, one of them he says is dictated to him by a fairy. He sort of was walking through the woods one day and saw a fairy singing a song on a leaf, and whatever else you make of that, certainly the point about seeing a fairy is to be in a kind of in-between zone, where what's more than you consciously might know can start to be revealed to you.
Yeah.
So
I wonder, just in parenthesis, I wonder if there is some link between Blake and Langland, whether Blake ever read Piers Plowman. But anyway,
I've never, so far as I've never heard anyone make the link. But that's
maybe
but that's not. It's only because the evidence doesn't survive.
Yeah. Can I come back to this notion of field, because you touched on it and we mentioned it briefly before we started recording, because it's a much misunderstood term, or at least it's thrown around and seems very mysterious, but it seems to belong with that family of terms like the unconscious and hidden knowledge and the imagination and all these things. What could we call them? As kind of repositories of other forms of knowing or something like that. So just to stop on that briefly, because I think the way I use the field anyway is that that is a form of collective unconscious knowledge, basically. So it's not just that of which we're collectively unaware, but it is something that contains knowledge and insight for us. So you and I are both familiar with this practice, systemic constellations. And systemic constellations depends on material that is brought forward from the field, which is, I keep using the word repository. It's not really right, because that suggests something topographic, and I don't think it's in a place. I think it's diffuse, dispersed, or intangible, or whatever. But what it suggests is, in a way, all of knowledge is available to us, not just archetypes, which was Jung's sort of take on it. I don't think he would have disagreed with the notion of the field, but that wasn't his focus. That somehow there is available to us all, all of human knowledge in some way that can be accessed, partly because, as you're saying, there is some ancestral connection which links us back to other people. It's not through DNA. Yes, it's through the body, but the channel isn't primarily a somatic one. We don't know exactly what it is. But all of us, you put a representative in a constellation. If I put you in, Mark, as a representative for my grandfather, who you never met, I barely ever met, you would immediately be able to, you'd become active with him in some way. We attribute that to the field giving of itself, the field being a bit like dark energy or dark matter, something whose presence we can never empirically observe, but which we kind of have to infer or posit in order to explain the phenomena that we can observe, which is a bit like how symptoms work in Freud. We posit the unconscious because we have Freudian slips. Freud, I don't think at any point said, the unconscious is there, or like those, is it phrenology, where you have areas of the brain? I don't think he ever said, the unconscious is that bit above the ear at the back, So anyway, the field, I think, is part of this conversation, even if much misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, just to stress the strength of making that inference. It is very remarkable what reveals itself when you represent someone in a constellation. You mentioned representing someone's father. I remember doing that once and immediately felt quite an intense pressure in my chest. And of course, it turned out, well, I don't know why I said of course, but it turned out that the actual father had died of a heart attack. Yeah. Now, I have no idea quite how that... well, I mean, I was going to say I have no idea how that works, but I suppose I do, in the sense that you posit that you do step into a field, and the form of the therapy is such that you are able to sort of step at least to one side of your normal, more egoic kind of concerns, and actually partly by using the body. My experience of it is it's a very embodied experience. You sort of drop down, might be the expression that's used, and there, as you're saying, instantly is there's information available that you receive sort of back through the body often. The sense of where you want to turn or where you want to be. So it is very powerful, and it quite often yields veridical information that you can sort of test either by someone who's there or finding out later.
Yes, it makes me wonder, again, maybe this is a slightly parenthetical thing, about this distinction between unconscious and subconscious, because in informal conversations people will often say subconscious or unconscious interchangeably. Of course, I'm a pedant, so I always insist on the difference between the two. For me, the unconscious is that as defined by Freud or Jung or what have you. But I wonder, actually, in the case of the field, maybe subconscious is actually a bit closer to it in some ways, because it's so immediate. It's as if it's just beneath the surface somehow, in a strange way. Although it's so profound, it seems like it's more readily accessible, strangely, than our own individual unconscious, or even the collective unconscious of Jung's. Like you say, immediately you're put in to represent somebody's father, and it's there, as if the flimsiest film, was separating us from all the other characters, ancestrally speaking, that we've been connected to, and not just in the human race, but in all animals on the planet, essentially.
Yeah. No,
so
I
maybe
like that actually. Sometimes when people use subconscious, I feel that they're a bit nervous of full strength unconsciousness,
yeah,
and so they just want to hold back a bit. But I do like the idea that there's that which is maybe just below the surface, but actually is sort of beating up from underneath the waves of our awareness. Whereas there is a deep unconscious sort of at the floor of the ocean, which is connected to us somehow, but only in very sort of labyrinthine ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Through lots of displacement, because that's the other thing. And Freud insists on this, that the dream is always, what he calls the dream work, is the work of the mind to take unconscious material and turn it into a dream, which is both condensed and displaced, as he said. It's both metaphorical and metonymic. So it is exactly, because you use the word labyrinthine there. The point about a dream is that it's cryptic. A point about constellation, it's not cryptic at all. It's the opposite. It's what people say about their lives that is cryptic. The representations from the field are actually extraordinarily transparent and straightforward, actually. So it's interesting. There's a kind of inversion going on there.
Well, maybe to throw in another thought on that, uncrypting even further was I remember reading in Owen Barfield once, this sort of philologist, philosopher, friend of Lewis and Tolkien, who is so influential on me, and he was a bit sort of sniffy about Jung. I think partly because Barfield's sort of guru, sage, was Rudolf Steiner, and Steiner and Jung were near contemporaries, and but even though both speaking in working in Germanic worlds, didn't really get on. I don't think they did have some correspondence, but at one point I think Jung was sniffy about Steiner because Steiner claimed to be able to access this Akashic record, which perhaps is another way of putting this field that we all have access to. And Jung remarked that how could Steiner read the Akashic field when he couldn't even read ancient Egyptian? Which Jung, of course, had books and books of hieroglyphs and was deeply into all that. But then Barfield at once makes this point, and he says, "Look, what we really need is not notions of the collective unconscious, but collective conscious." Which he meant new ways of relating to that which exists, maybe just subconsciously in the field, that which is just beneath the veil, and which would be no doubt in new ways, but developing new forms of maybe religiosity, devotion and worship, or accessing synchronicities, new kinds of divination even, given that they're the old ways that people lived with what we now call the unconscious, subconscious in the past. But Barfield wasn't just suggesting sort of nostalgically dragging them back into the present day as if it's some kind of magic, but using that past to try and provoke us almost into how working out ways to relate to all this activity. And I think for Barfield, psychotherapy was, a sort of good effort, maybe even a necessary effort. But I think because he suspected it of psychologizing, rather than really claiming sort of ground in an actual ontology of reality, the inside of the whole world, as Barfield put it, he could be a bit sniffy about it, inheriting that a little bit from the Steiner-Jung interchanges as well.
It's interesting you use the word psychologizing, because when I was teaching literature in Oxford in the 1990s to students, I was into literary theory, and particularly the kind of militant end, I suppose, the really hard stuff, Paul de Man and Derrida and so on. And there was a big resistance to psychologizing literature. You mustn't talk about the biography of the author, you mustn't explain texts through their psychology and so on. And in fact, one of the issues in psychoanalysis, and particularly the metaphor of the unconscious, is that it assumes depth and profundity. And, your metaphor of the ocean beneath the waves and lower down on the ocean floor does suggest a kind of vertical in some way. Even the collective unconscious, I sort of picture as something above us or maybe beneath us, but there's a sort of vertical line structurally to all of this. And the reason I'm thinking about it is, I read a book, astonishing book, last year called The Mind is Flat, that says actually these metaphors of depth and so on are not really that accurate, and really life is much more like a play that we improvise all the time, like characters that we respond to situations with the appropriate material. It's a bit like what Wittgenstein says in The Language Game. We are fairly pragmatic in terms of assembling meaning on the spot for the working play that we're currently enacting. Like you and I, we know each other well, and we know we have personalities that are consistent over time, more or less, and from that we infer sort of depth. I sort of see a depth to you, Mark. But in a certain sense, if we're being a bit more cynical, I guess, about it, maybe that's not true. All we ever really see is a kind of fairly familiar responding to each other in the moment and adjusting and mirroring and so on, which creates the illusion of depth, but in a sense is a much more pragmatic form of communication that just expedites, a conversation, essentially.
Yeah, well, I mean, something springs up from within me that wants to push back against that. Because I've no doubt that does happen. But I mean, two reasons really. One is that I feel that when you meet people who really are sort of dancing on the surface because they're terrified of sinking, what happens is actually rather dreary. It's repetitive, it's cyclical. It might be very charged because of terror and anxiety, but it doesn't really go anywhere. And part of the struggle with working with people who are caught in that kind of flatland is how just to sort of keep at it, because it's so interminable. And I feel, to sort of move to put it more slightly philosophically, that if all we did do was sort of play on the surface and adapt, we'd soon sort of run out of interest in life. And maybe that's part of the crisis of meaning today, now I say that. But that I think there is something that is right about the old notion, say, that inspiration is literally to be breathed into by a god, and that a more empirical reason for putting that is simply that, well, actually, William Blake says this. He says, if it weren't for the poetic and prophetic character, by which he means the people that are open to more, and all we had was the experimental and the philosophic, as he puts it, we very quickly end up just repeating the same dull round and be caught in what he calls the ratio. So there's something, it's, truth be known, quite strong in me that pushes back against that, actually.
No, I can feel it. Yeah, I can feel the depth. Maybe, can I just touch on this maybe as a last subject? I wanted to just talk about, and you're a practitioner, about the clinical manifestation of the unconscious or not. And, the degree to which you're tempted to sort of push people and come on, give me something a bit more unconscious here, or whether you can tell when material is a bit more, as it were, brought up freshly dripping from the unconscious, from the bottom of that pond, with the kind of the weeds around it, or whether it's really just an art of very fine discrimination. It's just not like that at all.
I think it's quite straightforward once you get the sense of it. And two big indicators. One is the emotional charge in the room, and when something feels emotionally alive, that you're on the interface of what's conscious and what's subconscious or unconscious. And then relatedly, because when something's emotionally charged, it's interesting and it grips you, time also kind of disappears from the room. And so another way of putting it is that if a session is sort of plodding along and you find yourself looking at the clock a bit and so on, that you need to try and get to something a bit deeper, to use the metaphor. And then when that starts to show itself, that which was more unconscious before, then you find that the charge goes up and time disappears. So those are very good sort of barometers of the kind of material that you're working with.
It's interesting. It reminds me of that book of Kissing, Tickling and Being Bored, the Adam Phillips book, where, if I remember it rightly, he basically says you should read boredom as a defense. So when people are boring you, it's because they're deliberately trying to keep you off the trail. They don't want you to see bits of themselves. They're trying to put you to sleep, basically, which they often do.
No, well, actually, without being too confessional, it was when I had my sort of big analysis, it was one of the things which my long-suffering therapist one day said to me was, you're trying to put me to sleep. And I was shocked and somewhat affronted by this. I thought I was talking about rather interesting stuff. But no, it was all coming from the wrong level, and she was precisely right.
Right. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, that's quite an intervention on their part. It's quite a strong interpretation, as we say.
It took me several weeks to get over it.
And it's still there, Mark. I can tell somewhere in the depths.
I remember it well now, yes. Yeah. Hey, look, that's really fascinating. A lot of things that link to this notion of unconsciousness. Maybe that's why it's become so pregnant in our culture. But I suppose, now we've talked around it, but I do have this sense that maybe it's a word that when we stop using it, it will have served its purpose, because we won't have to think that it's this sort of strange, esoteric, hidden sort of dynamic in life that many people would even dismiss and say is ridiculous, because we'll have become maybe not more conscious of what's going on, but more deliberate and intentional in our ways of negotiating that, which is more than us.
That's very nice. I like that a lot. Well, it's a pleasure talking to you, Mark. You haven't sent me to sleep. On the contrary, I feel quite stimulated. Makes a change, obviously. It's nice to see you.
Thanks very much indeed.
What to do next. Yeah, nice to
Cheers,
see you.
bye.
Bye.